The polished floors of the airport gleamed under the harsh white lights, reflecting the hurried steps of travelers chasing after their next destination. Among them, she walked, head high, posture elegant, her steps unhurried but purposeful. Her name was Maya Johnson. Today was special. She had worked hard for this, years of overtime, sacrificed weekends, countless moments of doubt and perseverance, all leading to this simple but significant reward, her very first trip in first class. Clutching her boarding pass, she approached the gate. The attendant at the counter barely glanced at her before forcing a tight smile and scanning the ticket. You're in first class?" the woman said, her voice betraying a trace of disbelief. Maya simply nodded, used to these small microaggressions, too tired to waste energy fighting everyone. As boarding was announced, Maya moved forward. Her heels clicked sharply against the jet bridge floor. Other passengers stepped aside, some looking at her with curiosity, others with silent judgment. Once inside the plane, the scent of leather and expensive cologne wrapped around her like a heavy mist. The first-class cabin was immaculate, wide seats, chilled champagne, the soft murmur of privileged conversation. Maya found her seat, 2A, by the window. She smiled quietly, allowing herself to savor this rare moment. She placed her bag neatly in the overhead compartment and settled into the plush seat, feeling a small wave of pride and happiness. It lasted only a few seconds. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the flight attendant approaching, a tall, stern woman with perfectly tied blonde hair and a uniform that seemed too tight across her stiff shoulders. The attendant stopped by Maya's seat, her smile brittle and cold. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, voice dripping with saccharine condescension. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Maya's throat tightened. She forced herself to stay calm. "I am," she said evenly, holding out her ticket. The woman barely glanced at it, then narrowed her eyes. "I'm going to need to verify this with the gate," she snapped, snatching the ticket and turning on her heel without waiting for a response. Maya felt dozens of eyes burning into her skin. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. She heard snippets. Maybe she snuck in. Security should check her. This is why we can't have nice things. She sat frozen, fingers gripping the armrests, heart pounding with rage and humiliation. The welcome she had dreamed of was already twisted into a nightmare. The minutes stretched like hours as Maya sat frozen in her seat, acutely aware of the eyes that kept darting toward her, whispering, judging. Each breath felt heavier than the last. The tension in the air was almost tangible, a thick, choking cloud of suspicion and disdain. Across the aisle, an older white man leaned over to his wife, his voice low but clear enough for Maya to hear. "Probably a mix-up," he muttered, "or a free upgrade gone wrong." His wife chuckled softly, shaking her head. "They're getting bolder these days." Maya closed her eyes briefly, forcing back the sting that threatened to rise. She had learned long ago not to let them see her cry. Not here, not now. The flight attendant returned, her steps brisk and purposeful. She stopped beside Maya's seat once again, now accompanied by another attendant, a younger man who looked just as uncomfortable as he was complicit. "I'm afraid there's an issue with your boarding pass," the woman announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, as if deliberately inviting their validation. "It's legitimate," Maya said quietly but firmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. The attendant's smile tightened further. "Then you won't mind if we verify it again," she said, signaling toward the young male attendant, who radioed for security. Within moments, a uniformed security officer appeared at the entrance of the cabin. He was tall, heavy-set, and wore an expression of mild annoyance, as if Maya's very presence was an inconvenience to his day. "Ma'am, could you please come with me?" he said in a tone that suggested it wasn't really a request. Maya felt every pair of eyes locked onto her as she rose slowly from her seat. She held her head high, refusing to shrink under their scrutiny. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept them steady, clutching her bag close to her body. As she stepped into the aisle, she heard a woman's voice, smug, satisfied. "Knew it," someone muttered from a few rows back. Maya didn't turn her head. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The security officer led her toward the front of the plane, past the gaping faces of first-class passengers who watched her like an exhibit, an intruder being removed from a sanctuary meant only for them. Each step felt like a trial, each look a verdict. By the time she reached the exit, her heart thundered in her chest, not from fear, but from a deep, burning rage. How quickly they had judged her, how easily they had condemned her. And yet, she still hadn't said a word. "Not yet. Before we continue, let's take a brief pause." We would love to know, where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoy these powerful stories, don't forget to subscribe to stay with us. Now, let's continue. Standing near the airplane door, Maya felt like a criminal displayed for the amusement of the privileged few. She could see the phones discreetly raised by trembling hands, recording her shame to post online, perhaps to mock later in group chats or private conversations. The security officer whispered into his radio, his words too low to catch, but his glances at Maya were loud enough. He didn't see her as a woman, a person, only a problem to be handled, disposed of quietly. The flight attendant who had humiliated her earlier returned, holding her boarding pass in one hand and a smug expression on her face. "I'm sorry," she said, voice devoid of real apology, "but there seems to be a mistake. We don't have you listed in our first-class manifest." Maya's jaw clenched. She knew what this was, a deliberate attempt to erase her, to make her feel like she didn't belong even if she had every right. "I paid for my seat," Maya said firmly, her voice calm but sharp as steel. "You can check again." The woman's lips twitched, almost in a sneer. "Please step aside, ma'am. You're holding up the boarding process." Passengers continued to filter past them, some sneaking quick, pitying glances, others smirking openly. "Maybe she should know her place," a man muttered under his breath as he walked by. His wife laughed softly beside him. The words hit Maya like a slap. Her hands trembled harder now, from fury, not fear. The security officer shifted, uncomfortable. For a split second, something almost like doubt flashed in his eyes, but he said nothing. His role was not to question, only to enforce. Maya realized she had two choices. She could cause a scene, give them exactly what they wanted, a disruptive black woman to justify their actions, or she could stay silent and endure. But endurance felt like another kind of death. Swallowing the thick knot in her throat, Maya looked straight at the flight attendant. "Call your supervisor," she said. Now, the attendant's eyes widened, caught off guard by the firm authority in Maya's voice. Still, she hesitated. "Now," Maya repeated, louder. Passengers paused to watch. The atmosphere tightened, a suffocating expectation hanging in the air. For the first time, the smugness on the flight attendant's face cracked. Without a word, she turned on her heel and disappeared down the jet bridge, leaving Maya standing tall and alone before a jury of strangers. The humiliation wasn't over, but for the first time, Maya refused to let it swallow her whole. The moments dragged painfully. Maya remained standing near the plane's entrance, feeling the weight of 100 eyes stabbing into her back. The murmurs grew louder. Some passengers had stopped boarding altogether, craning their necks for a better view, their faces twisted in amusement or disdain. Finally, the flight attendant returned, not alone this time. Behind her walked a woman in a neatly pressed navy blue uniform, the supervisor. She was tall, middle-aged, her blonde hair twisted into a severe bun, her lips painted in a harsh shade of red that made her look more like a judge than a customer service manager. She didn't smile. She didn't introduce herself. She simply stood before Maya, looking her up and down with cold, assessing eyes, as if calculating exactly how much trouble this black woman was worth. "What seems to be the problem here?" the supervisor asked, her tone clipped, impatient. Before Maya could speak, the original flight attendant jumped in. "This passenger is claiming to have a first-class seat, but she's not listed on our manifest," she said, her voice syrupy sweet but laced with poison. The supervisor turned her gaze back to Maya. "Boarding pass," she said curtly, extending her hand. Maya handed it over, her fingers brushing against the supervisor's palm. She flinched, almost imperceptibly, as if touched by something dirty. The supervisor scanned the boarding pass, her brows knitting slightly. Then she pulled a small device from her belt and scanned it again. For a moment, something flashed across her screen, something that made her frown, not in confusion, but in recognition. "You bought this ticket?" she asked sharply. "Yes," Maya answered steadily, "with my own money. Months ago." The supervisor pursed her lips, hesitating. The air tightened again. The crowd leaned closer. "You'll need to step aside while we verify," the supervisor said at last. Her voice had softened, not out of kindness, but calculation. She had seen something that didn't match the story they wanted to believe. Still, Maya moved to the side, standing against the cold wall near the jet bridge. She felt small, isolated, exposed. As the supervisor turned away, Maya caught a glimpse of the screen she held. Her name was there. Her seat number was there. Confirmed. Valid. Yet they were still treating her like a liar, a thief, an intruder. How long is this going to take? She asked, her patience thinning. The supervisor glanced over her shoulder. As long as necessary, she said sharply, loud enough for everyone to hear. From somewhere behind Maya, a voice rang out. If she can't afford it, she shouldn't fake it. The word stung more deeply than she expected. Maya turned slightly, searching for the speaker, but they had already melted back into the crowd. The humiliation was relentless, sharp and deliberate, and every second was designed to grind her dignity into dust. And yet, deep inside, a fire was growing. She would not let them erase her. Not now, not ever. Maya stood alone by the jet bridge, her back against the cold, sterile wall. The hustle and bustle of boarding continued, but the tension in the air felt like a heavy storm, thick with the weight of silent judgments and unspoken questions. She had become the spectacle, the source of everyone's curiosity. People had stopped pretending they weren't watching, and she could feel every single pair of eyes on her like invisible hands. The supervisor had turned her back on Maya, but Maya refused to look away. Every muscle in her body was tense, her fists clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. The humiliation was unbearable, but what hurt more was the sense of powerlessness. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about something much deeper, a system that viewed her as less, a system that expected her to bow down, to accept the script they'd written for her. The supervisor was still talking to the flight attendant in hushed tones, their words too quiet for Maya to catch, but the flickers of their glances told her everything she needed to know. They were plotting, making decisions about her fate, and it wasn't going to be good. Maya turned her gaze toward the cabin, trying to find any semblance of comfort. The other passengers, the ones who were still seated in their places, pretended to ignore the scene, but the air was thick with their discomfort and their judgment. Then, unexpectedly, a voice broke the silence. "Excuse me," a woman's voice said, low but steady. Maya turned to find a middle-aged black woman standing a few feet away. Her hair was done in neat braids, and she wore simple but elegant clothing, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "I was watching from my seat," the woman continued, her voice louder now, "and I just wanted to say, I saw your boarding pass. It's valid. You belong in that seat. They don't get to do this." Maya blinked, taken aback. She wasn't used to hearing support in situations like this, not in a place like this, not from people who were too scared to speak up, too afraid to stand against the tide of privilege and racism. But this woman, she had spoken out. "I'm sorry this is happening to you," the woman said, now standing directly in front of Maya. "I've seen this happen before. It's disgusting. You don't deserve this." Maya felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't just the words that struck her. It was the fact that someone, a stranger, was validating her, was standing up for her when no one else seemed to care. And then, the unexpected happened. Another passenger, a young white man, stood up from his seat and slowly made his way down the aisle. His movements were deliberate, his face set in a determined expression. "I'm sorry," he said, standing next to the black woman, his eyes now on the supervisor. "This is wrong. She's been more than patient, and you're treating her like a criminal." The supervisor's eyes flicked to him, a scowl forming on her face, but she didn't say anything. The young man's words seemed to hang in the air, thick with the weight of truth. "You're humiliating her in front of everyone," he continued, his voice getting louder now. "We're all watching. You need to fix this." Maya's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and pride. The support she had been waiting for, hoping for, was finally here. It wasn't just from one person. It was from many. People were finally standing up, speaking out. And Maya wasn't going to back down. Maya stood her ground, a quiet but unwavering resolve in her eyes. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and she could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her. Some were watching with disbelief, others with awe, but everyone was waiting for the next move. No one had expected the situation to escalate like this. Maya wasn't just defending her right to be seated in first class, she was standing up to a system that had been designed to humiliate and oppress. The supervisor's face twisted with rage as the man who had intervened stepped back, standing tall next to Maya. The passengers around them were no longer passive observers. Murmurs of support were growing louder, filling the space between the sharp exchanges. Maya felt a surge of empowerment. This was no longer just her fight. The flight attendant who had started it all, the one who had first challenged Maya, stood nearby, her eyes dark with frustration. The supervisor turned to her, her voice low but threatening. "Get back to your seat," she snapped. "You've already caused enough trouble." The flight attendant hesitated, but then complied. Walking back to her position, Maya's eyes followed her movements. Noting how the woman's shoulders were stiff with tension, it was clear that the power dynamic had shifted. Maya was no longer a target. She was a symbol of resistance. You think you've won? The supervisor hissed, taking a step forward again. You think this is over? You have no idea who you're messing with. Maya raised her chin higher, standing taller. If that was even possible, the supervisor's words were empty threats, meant to scare her, but they had no effect. Maya had already made her decision. She was going to fight for her dignity, no matter what. No, Maya replied, her voice calm but resolute. I think I've just begun. The tension seemed to peak as the entire cabin grew still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next moment. The supervisor's nostrils flared, and she took a step closer to Maya. For a moment, it seemed like a confrontation was inevitable. But then, something unexpected happened. A woman, seated 2 rows ahead, stood up and shouted, I support her. We all support her. Her voice rang out through the cabin, and for a brief moment, everyone fell silent. And then, more voices joined in. One by one, passengers were speaking up, voicing their support for Maya, each one lending their voice to the collective outcry. The supervisor froze, her face pale. The unexpected show of solidarity caught her off guard. Maya's heart swelled as she realized what was happening. This was no longer just about her. This was about everyone who had ever been subjected to unfair treatment, to discrimination, to being told they didn't belong. The passengers had made their choice, and there was no going back. Maya turned to the supervisor, her voice firm and steady. You're not going to intimidate me. You're not going to break me, and you're not going to keep me from my seat. The supervisor looked around at the growing number of people who had gathered behind Maya. Their eyes were filled with a mix of anger and determination. It was clear that the battle was shifting in Maya's favor. You have no idea what you're doing, the supervisor muttered, her voice trembling with frustration. But Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. The support she had received from the other passengers spoke louder than any words she could say. Maya had found her voice, and it was resonating with those around her. And then, the unexpected happened again. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been made aware of the situation in the first-class cabin. We ask that everyone remain seated and calm. We are addressing this matter. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned toward the front of the plane, waiting for the captain to continue. But the wait was agonizing. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. The supervisor glanced nervously at the front of the plane, then back at Maya. She was losing control, and she knew it. The captain's intervention only further signaled that this was no longer an issue to be dealt with by a single flight attendant. It had become something larger, something more significant than any of them had anticipated. Maya could feel the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This was a turning point. This was the moment when everything would change. The supervisor had underestimated her, and now she was starting to realize it. The passengers, their voices rising in unison, had begun to chant, "Let her stay, let her stay." In that moment, Maya knew she had won. It wasn't about the seat anymore. It wasn't even about the flight. It was about the collective strength of people coming together to fight injustice, to speak out against oppression, to demand respect for every individual. The tension in the air was palpable now. More heads turned. More people were staring, some with disbelief, others with approval. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She was shocked, not only because of the support, but because it was coming from people who had, until now, been silent. And yet, there was something else. The feeling of powerlessness still lingered. There was still the supervisor, still the system that felt intent on destroying her dignity. The supervisor's eyes narrowed as she glared at the young man. "Stay out of this," she snapped, her voice harsh and cold. "You don't know the full story." "I don't need to," he shot back. "I can see what you're doing. It's wrong." The tension in the cabin grew to a boiling point. It was as if the air itself was thick with the collective weight of everyone's breath, held in anticipation. The room was divided, some passengers looking away, uncomfortable, while others stood tall, silently supporting Maya, their silent rebellion speaking volumes. And then, the supervisor's face tightened into a mask of authority. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying authority now. "You can either take your seat or leave the plane. But this ends now." Maya felt her breath catch in her throat. This was it, the moment when everything would change. It was going to be up to her to decide how much longer she would stand for this, how much longer she would let them break her, humiliate her. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, and for a brief moment, she was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of their expectations. But then, she made her decision. Maya stood up straighter, squared her shoulders, and faced the supervisor. "You don't get to decide my worth," she said, her voice strong and steady. "Not today, not ever." The words echoed through the cabin, and in that moment, something shifted. It was as if the air in the room had changed, like a collective breath had been held for far too long and finally released. The supervisor's face tightened, but she didn't speak. There was nothing more she could say. And for the first time in a long time, Maya felt like she had the upper hand. The silence that followed Maya's declaration was heavy, suffocating. For a brief moment, it seemed like time itself had stopped. The passengers, the crew, everyone was holding their breath. No one spoke. No one moved. The supervisor's face tightened. Her jaw clenched in frustration. She was used to having control, used to being the one to dictate how things went. But Maya had just shattered that illusion. She had stood up, with grace, dignity, and power, and had said what no one else was willing to say. The supervisor's gaze flicked to the flight attendant standing behind her, her eyes sharp and cold. The tension between the two women was palpable, thick with unspoken threats. But Maya wasn't backing down. "You'll regret this," the supervisor said through gritted teeth. Her voice was low, but the venom in her words was clear. Maya didn't flinch. She had no intention of letting fear dictate her actions anymore. She had been afraid for so long, afraid of what people might think, afraid of the consequences of speaking out. But now, she had found her voice. "I won't regret standing up for what's right," Maya replied, her tone steady, unwavering. "What you're doing is wrong, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The supervisor's eyes flickered with anger. She had expected Maya to back down, to apologize, to shrink into herself. But instead, Maya was defiant, and the supervisor didn't know how to handle it. "Get out of the way," the supervisor snapped at the flight attendant, her voice filled with disgust. "I'll deal with this myself." The flight attendant stepped aside, her eyes full of resentment. She had been the one to start all of this, the one who had instigated the conflict, and now she was watching as her plan unraveled before her eyes. The supervisor took a step toward Maya, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. There was a dangerous energy in her movements, a kind of predatory grace. She was trying to intimidate Maya, trying to make her feel small again, trying to remind her who had the power here. But Maya wasn't intimidated. "Move," the supervisor ordered. "You're in the way." Maya remained unmoving, her back straight and her shoulders squared. She wasn't going to give in to this woman's demands, no matter how much she tried to push her around. "I'm not going anywhere," Maya said, her voice firm. "I paid for my seat. I belong here." The supervisor's nostrils flared, and for a split second, Maya saw something flash in her eyes, something darker, something that made her feel like she was being hunted. "Listen to me," the supervisor hissed, her tone turning dangerous. "I don't know who you think you are, but I can make your life miserable. I can make sure you never fly again. You'll never step foot in a first-class cabin. I can ruin you." Maya's heart raced, but she didn't let the threat affect her. She had heard these kinds of threats before. She had seen people like this woman try to break others, try to crush their spirits. But Maya wasn't like the others. She wasn't going to be broken. "You can try," Maya said, her voice a calm, steady whisper, "but you'll fail." For a moment, the supervisor stood there, staring at Maya, her face twisted with fury. The air between them was thick with tension. It was a battle now, a battle for power, for control, for dignity. And just when it seemed like the supervisor might finally strike, there was a sound, a voice, a man's voice, booming across the cabin. "Hey, what's going on here?" The passengers in the cabin turned toward the source of the voice, and Maya's eyes landed on a man who had just stood up from his seat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a look of utter disbelief on his face. He was wearing a suit, but his expression wasn't one of business or politeness. It was a look of someone who had seen enough, someone who wasn't going to let this injustice slide. The man marched down the aisle toward them, his eyes locked on the supervisor, his face set in a hard, determined expression. "Why are you harassing this woman?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. "She has a valid ticket. You have no right to treat her like this." The supervisor's face turned bright red with anger. "Stay out of this," she spat. "This doesn't concern you." But the man didn't flinch. He stood tall, unyielding. "I don't care if it concerns me or not," he said. "What I care about is that she's being treated unfairly, and that concerns everyone. You don't get to treat people like this. Not on my watch." There was a shift in the atmosphere. A sense of solidarity, a sense of right and wrong, seemed to settle over the cabin. The passengers, who had been watching in silence, began to murmur among themselves. some nodding in agreement, others simply looking on in shock. The air was thick with the weight of what was happening, with the recognition that this wasn't just about a seat on a plane. This was about something much bigger. And in that moment, Maya knew that no matter what happened next, she had made a difference. Before we continue, let's take a brief pause. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. We continue now. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with anticipation. The captain's voice had silenced the murmurs, but the tension was still hanging in the air like an electric current, crackling between the passengers and flight attendants. Maya's chest rose and fell with each breath, but her resolve had never been stronger. She was no longer just a passenger on this flight. She was a symbol of resistance, of standing up for what's right. As the minutes ticked by, the supervisor seemed to shrink. The authority she had once held over the situation was gone. The passengers had united in support of Maya, their voices louder than any threats or orders. This was no longer her fight alone. This was a fight for every person who had ever been treated unjustly, humiliated, or forced to feel inferior. The flight attendant who had first challenged Maya, the one who had started the entire ordeal, remained silent now, her back to the wall. She avoided eye contact with Maya, her posture a mixture of guilt and fear. The power had shifted. Maya was no longer a victim. She was in control. Minutes later, the captain's voice returned through the intercom, calm and authoritative. We've reviewed the situation and, after considering all factors, we've made the decision to allow the passenger in question to remain in her seat. All further actions will be handled appropriately. There was a brief pause, and then, without warning, a ripple of applause spread through the cabin. It began as a few scattered claps, but soon grew louder, spreading like wildfire. Passengers stood up, some raising their fists, others nodding with approval. Maya stood there, unmoving, her heart swelling with pride. She had fought for her right to be treated with respect, and the world had finally heard her. The supervisor, red-faced and defeated, walked toward the front of the plane, her steps slow and heavy. She knew her authority had been stripped away. She had lost not just this battle, but the respect of the people she had once ruled over. Maya sat back down, her body still trembling from the tension, but her mind was at peace. She had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or oppressed. This was more than a seat in first class. This was a statement. As the flight continued its journey, Maya felt a quiet but profound sense of accomplishment. She had been a part of something larger than herself, a movement, a moment, a reminder that standing up against injustice could change the course of a life, a flight, or even the world. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but Maya knew that what had happened on that plane would stay with her forever. The support of the passengers, the intervention of the captain, the power of solidarity, these were the things that mattered. These were the things that changed everything. And as the plane touched down, Maya stepped off, no longer just a passenger, but a force to be reckoned with. She had made her stand, and the world was watching.